We're going to focus on just a few topics today. Now, there's a lot of different benefits of having a tech company in BC, some of which are announced in every budget. We're going to focus primarily on the stock options and equity incentives, group benefits, and I'll touch briefly on key person insurance just because I realize there are a few tech founders in the room. Now, how many of you are tech founders in the room? Just a quick show of hands. Okay. And how many of you have partners in your business? Okay. So if one of you got hit by a bus, what happens? Kind of an unfortunate thing to think about, but something that a lot of founders don't realize until it's too late, or they start going after Series A financing. And that really is ensuring your risks are taken care of. So if a founder was to get hit, what happens to those shares? Does the spouse now own those shares, and now you're in business with the partner of your founder? Or is there an insurance policy set up to buy those shares? And then the remaining founders would own the rest of the business. So just a brief topic to think about, because I find that a lot of founders don't think about it until it's fairly late in the game. And it's not very expensive to set up, so make sure you talk to a professional about that. So what are we seeing in the group benefits space? And this is not just on the group benefits and pension, but just really all incentives you can offer employees other than pay. So Jeff, why don't we start with you, because Apollo really has been shooting up to the stars, if you will, over the last year. So I was looking for a better way to describe that, but why don't you tell us a little bit about what's been working for you at Apollo and what hasn't been working?
Culture recruiting.
Yeah.
Is this on? I think, so we're, the Apollo Exchange essentially takes paper-based small business insurance transactions and puts them online. So right now we're Canada's largest online insurance marketplace for small businesses. We've got about 10 insurance companies that back us with products, and we're about 2 years old. And so, early on, I think from a cultural perspective, you just have to try and get people to buy into your vision and crazy enough to sort of quit their jobs and come with you on some sort of adventure. From the benefits perspective, I think that if I give any advice to any startup founder, before you quit your corporate job, get your teeth cleaned, right? Go to the physio or any of those things, and also decide on what rec sports you're not going to play anymore. A buddy of mine has got a startup, was playing rec hockey, got really injured, and all of a sudden it's like your benefits concept doesn't really think through. So early on, and when it was just sort of a small group of us kind of co-founders, we weren't thinking about how do we recruit new people using benefits. It was just like, oh, wait a minute, your clothes get a year older, your teeth, oh, wait a minute, that dental bill, you never actually looked at the full bill back when you had a corporate job. And so it was really just like the perseverance and just making things a little more comfortable when you're not really collecting a full paycheck. And really having that clear understanding of what do you need early on versus what do you need later.
Does that give a good starting point? No, that was really great. So typically what we see is a lot of tech founders, they don't set up benefits for their employees early on because they're just trying to survive. So a lot of the employees you bring on, you're selling them the dream of what this business is going to be 5 years from now, and benefits are an afterthought. However, when you do have enough funding to set it up, it actually can be quite inexpensive dollar per dollar, because on a pre-tax basis, the benefits are actually not going to cost the employee anything from a tax perspective. So it's something to think about. Now, on the stock options and equity side, why don't we have Andrew share a little bit about why those are beneficial for some of the clients he works with?
Yeah, and this is, it's an interesting discussion that you have sort of the insurance and benefits guys sitting over here, and a lot of people are interested in stock options. It's very interesting. We had a bit of a smaller session on a similar topic a few months ago, and everybody wanted to know about that side and not as about the stock options. Why it's a really good combination to be talking about at the same time is because you're talking about incentives. You are out there building your companies, growing your companies, you want to attract good people. And yeah, absolutely people want to work with a fun culture and a good mission and having an impact they like, and of course the pay that they like. That's all well and good. But some of the questions that you're going to talk about getting some of the people that you really want to be getting in the door, that can be a little more selective, that know what they're looking for. Part of it is going to be, if I work really hard, and I align myself with the interests and values of this organization, of your companies, what's my reward going to be financially? And options are traditionally one of the ways that they provide those rewards. So there's great stories, for example, about the early days of Microsoft people had some equity stake. You could get options, you could get other equity that if the company does really well, you're going to financially do really well. I think we've all heard about, Facebook had a mural artist that was drawing murals on the wall, or the massage therapist that because they took their payment in the form of options, then they became a millionaire once Facebook went out and did their initial public offering, right? But and that alignment is what you're looking for. And there's cautionary tales where, for example, Microsoft that I mentioned before, there's stories where it grew too big, they stopped making that part of people's packages, they have too many thousands of people, and well now instead of I'm really aligned to go and work that extra time on a Friday night and get us to the goal, now it's about, well, I just want to be able to get my paycheck and get out of here, right? So what people are looking for is going to depend a little bit on the size and scale of your company, doing a little bit of the math financially, talking to the folks. I mean, we've got somebody from MNP here talk about the financial aspects of it, but it's really around alignment with what your talented people that you're trying to attract are going to be looking for. Part of that's going to be financial incentives, part of that's going to be all the other pieces that make it an attractive work environment.
Thanks, Andrew, and I have to fully agree with that. There's no silver bullet to finding the best hire. It's up to you and your HR team to determine what actually is important to these employees. A family of 4 might really care about benefits because they have dental expenses for their kids, as opposed to the single 27-year-old developer who might just want to get paid a bit more. Or they want to have an impact on the world. And if your company can have a positive impact on the world, that might actually resonate with them more than pumping a couple $1,000 into a benefits program for them. So stock options are an important piece. Benefits are an important piece. Your culture is an important piece. So Jeff, why don't you share a little bit about the Apollo culture? I know you guys are in Gastown, so you're living the traditional startup life over there. How has it started from when it was just you and David to now when you've got a group of employees with different expectations?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think phase and where you're at is the most important thing for looking at these different aspects. At the very beginning of our company, employee stock options weren't really a driver for us. What was important was that the co-founders obviously had equity. That's why we quit our jobs. The most important things we used stock options for at the very beginning was advisors. So we were very fortunate to build out an advisory group of people who had sort of been there before. We couldn't pay them, but they were sort of senior entrepreneurs. They were people that were willing to take their advisory capacity and be involved in our company for introductions to investors, support on our strategy, support with our investment deck. And it was really for us, it was recruiting those early advisors, and that's how we used our ESOP agreement early on. It wasn't about going to bring in additional employees. It was sort of the founding team. So for the team that was sort of operational, it was very much, you hear stories about, oh, there's beer on tap and that. Canned beer is a lot more effective than beer in a keg, just for the record. But what it really came down to was like, all right, we're all excited. We're doing this mission. We're on this vision. Well, how can we bring in senior people to advise us? And we put them on advisory agreements that had stock options as compensation. As we kind of graduated and started adding more people, we raised some investment capital because we had those advisors supporting us in that process. Then it became important to say, all right, well, what's our hiring roadmap? You kind of say, well, oh, your HR team's going to make some of these decisions. There is no HR team. It's like us, right? So really you're looking at it and saying, well, what motivates those people? And for some people, they didn't care about stock options at all. They're just like, yeah, I'll come work there, sure. They didn't value the equity, and we actually dodged a couple of bullets early on where we were like, hey, you can have equity, and they're just like, I don't know, like, it doesn't really matter, like, can you just pay me and I'll just come to work? And really, you can end up giving up a little bit more than you might need to from that stock option perspective for people that don't value that versus something else that they might really be a driver for them because they like what you're doing, they like the culture, they like the project that you can work on, the technology stack that you have. It's really about asking those questions early on before you just start throwing equity on the table. I think you hear about the Microsoft stories and you hear about these founder stories of, that the painter got stock options, but a lot of people that you interact with, in this room, we're like, yeah, stock options. A lot of people that just have a regular job, they don't care. They don't know about stock options. They don't understand them. They're not driven by the potential of some equity exit. They're just like, yeah, I want to come work at a cool young company and like that's a fun thing. So also be careful about how you kind of ration those options because it's really going to drive and change your valuation structure later on for future investing rounds. And I can talk about that, after. But it's really about aligning their equity, what stage you're at, because early on it's advisors, it's board members who might be super senior people. How do you bring them in? They're going to help you raise some capital, validate your product market fit, and then it's about hiring people and actually employee stock options later on. But it really didn't come for us until sort of later on in the process.
Oh, that's a really good point. And Andrew, I know due to client confidentiality, you can't speak to specifics, but have you seen any problems in the past where maybe too much equity was given out too early with some of the tech companies in Vancouver?
Yeah, it's not even just about giving out too much equity early. It's a really good point you make, and I actually just want to echo Jeff's point about it's not just employees that look for options or some incentives. Getting advisors on board, especially in the earlier stages of your organization, it was fantastic tip. I have a good friend. He is one of the co-founders and one of the executives now of a successful tech company here in Vancouver. They're doing really well. But he originally came out to Vancouver from Waterloo, which is where I come from, went out to work for this tech company. Oh, your salary is going to be a little bit down here, but we're going to give you all these options so that when the company does really well, you're going to do really well. Very few people that get those options are ever going to actually sit and talk to a lawyer or have somebody really translate what that means. And I see a friend in the front row who knows corporate finance is smiling a little bit at this point. Wow, I've got options. Maybe someday I'm going to be the Facebook mural person or the massage therapist that's going to be a millionaire. This is great, right? That's not always the case. For example, we look very closely for a lot of our clients, and we act, myself at my firm, we act both for some of the folks that will be buying tech companies and then for some of the tech companies themselves that are growing and looking to develop and be bought or get publicly listed. You really need to be careful that you actually have the protections in place as an option holder. Or if you're running the business, some of your more savvy shareholders or option holders will be looking for these protections in place. There's a great part in that movie, The Social Network, where the one character comes in, the Mark Zuckerberg character is sitting on his laptop, plugged in, as the saying goes, on his headphones, and the character comes in and is really angry at him and just smashes his laptop. It's, yeah, you screwed me over. Well, part of that was that person had some equity in the company, but they used mechanisms in the legal documents to basically dilute them down. My friend that I was mentioning earlier came here, worked at a tech company, was offered a lot of his salary in options, and he took it. That company later diluted down to, by the time that company got sold, there were some billions of shares. And so he got a check for, a few $100, right? It was certainly not worth all the extra Friday nights, all the late hours, all the extra sweat that he put in. Now, he eventually figured that early on. He didn't stay with the company the whole time. It was some years later that he got that letter saying, congratulations, today's your payday. And by the way, the amount is going to be very small because over the years, we've diluted it down very much. So one of the things that if you're an option holder, or one of the things that you want to be aware of if you're issuing options to employees, to advisors or others, especially the advisors because they're going to be very savvy to it, is what is the actual impact is going to be and what are some of the mechanisms that you can use. Right now, just walking over here, we got a letter of intent that one of our clients wants to buy a tech company locally. One of the first parts, right from the beginning of conversations, is who's got what options, what's out there, how are we going to pay for that, what's it going to cost us to do? And yes, absolutely, if you can be a little bit too free with the options in the early days, you could potentially pay for that much greater financially later on.
So we've talked a bit about the benefits and drawbacks of stock options. We've talked a little bit about benefits. Now, on the benefits side, something to keep in mind is when you're setting these programs up, you can set up a skeleton plan and then a Rolls Royce down the road. Because if you've got your Amazon, your Facebook, your Google, many of which are hiring here in Vancouver, your best employees are going to get contacted by a recruiter and they're going to get given the Rolls Royce plan. So it's going to be difficult for you to compete on that front. So you really do have to leverage a combination of these incentives, whether they be the benefits, stock options, or the culture. And how you combine those three are really going to help retain some of your best talent, specifically in the development front. So Jeff, you've got some pretty talented developers. I've worked through your platform and it's pretty impressive. How have you had any of your developers leave? And if you haven't, how have you managed to keep them on board?
I'm not a developer myself, and developers are interesting creatures. I don't know if there's any in the room. The reasons why people will do things aren't necessarily what you think. So I think one thing I learned early on is you can't project your values or the things that motivate you as a founder onto other people that will come in different roles. And so, for instance, for me, I come from a finance background, from a sales background. My drivers aren't the same as someone who really just wants a certain problem to solve or wants a certain tech stack. Or it might be a developer who's used to sort of living in a very narrow kind of window, and they get access to solving larger problems, and they get career advancement by being challenged more than they were in another position. So I think that's definitely a factor, is like just what you're working on in the project can be a fit and can be something that keeps people around. For us, the equity piece was very important. Almost all of our employees are shareholders, and I'm proud of that. And I'd rather dilute myself a little bit to be able to make sure that everybody else can have that kind of same mentality. And we're also very transparent about valuation, about raising money, and about those aspects. But there are a lot of clauses around that, right? And there are a lot of nuances to how we structure that. One thing with the developer side of it is a lot of times, people will be getting offered options at any job they have, so it becomes a moot point. So you have to still, at the end of the day, if they're offered X salary and X options at your company and X salary and X options somewhere else, and that's all the same, they're still going to go back to what's the problem that they're solving, the work that they get to do, and the culture that you get to build. So you can't think that just by throwing options at people, you're going to differentiate yourself. It's not necessarily the case. You have to be able to still focus on those core values and the core culture that you're building beyond just sort of throwing options at people for we're going to be Facebook one day and you're all going to get paid. The other aspect of that is as you add more funding, like you said, you add more shares, you can dilute down, you can have preferred share classes layered on. We're very careful about structuring and protecting against that, but sometimes, the math makes sense and you have to take those deals. And so at the end of the day, the equity piece of it, year over year, people still want to raise, they still want benefits, they still want to be part of a momentum and a fun thing. And those things really can't compete as much with the fact that they have options in their back pocket, but it might retain them. And the way that we found that retaining them is vesting schedules, right? So when you issue options right away, you don't say, hey, here's all of your shares up front. It's here's your shares and you have to stay year number 2, year number 3, year number 4 for those certain options to continue to vest so that you're basically waiting for that time period and they're not going to be as eager to take that recruiter's phone call because they know they have to wait till that next timeline on your horizon.
Thanks, Jeff. So what I'd like to do now is just open up the floor to questions. We've kind of given you the lay of the land. Before we jump in, just on the benefit side, what we are seeing is most employers are offering more flex care benefits, not the traditional paper box plan that gives you X number of benefits, X number of dollars. You'll basically just give $500 to your employees. They could spend it on almost anything, and that gives them a little more flexibility. So I won't get too deep into that because I know people are more interested in the stock incentives piece. So why don't we move over to questions from the audience? John.
Is there going to be any discussion today around the tax event of receiving stock options, vesting of the options, and so on?
It's a great point. I'll speak a bit to it, although I will preface by saying I'm not an accountant. When you are issuing stock options, there typically is not a tax incentive until those are exercised for the employee. The employee, when they exercise those options, there is going to be taxable income from the difference from the strike price and the exercise price. Generally, they won't see that until they actually exercise those options. Andrew, I don't know if you want to speak more to that. I recognize you're not an accountant as well.
A little bit. I've got a good friend who's a lawyer, and he's got a saying that if you hire a lawyer and you ask that lawyer a question and the answer is not, it depends, then you should fire your lawyer. And this is a very good example of one of those it depends questions. If you came to me and you said, well, tell me about the tax things. First of all, I'm not a tax lawyer. We can get to one of the tax lawyers, somebody who's an accountant. But basically to be discussing some of these issues, you want to be looking at a lot of different factors that you might not even be thinking of, right? Where's the company? A lot of companies are sitting here in Vancouver. It's going to be a British Columbia corporation, but not necessarily. Some of you have gone down to Y Combinator or somewhere else down in the valley and you've started up an American company and then you've got Canadian employees. If you're going to be talking about issuing options, are they going to be to Canadian residents? Are they going to be to somebody who's working remotely that you've got engaged in the United States or somewhere else? That's going to be a big piece. What other deal documents do you have that might arrange deferred payments? I just spent a lot of the last 48 hours, not options specifically, but somebody had rights in a specific document that is very similar to what an option is. And they were entitled to this payment and they suddenly said, whoa, 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 if we get this payment that you all want to pay us right now, it's going to result in a very large tax bill based on the specifics of just how this payment is getting structured and how it's flowing down. We actually want to change all the documents so we don't get this payment now. So it's a little bit challenging depending on those. So I would really strongly recommend to anybody in the room, as you're thinking about not just the options piece, but the whole piece about your capital structure, what kinds of shares you're going to have, what kinds of options or warrants or other financial incentives you're going to have, sit down and chat with some people that know what they're doing and give them the whole lay of the land. One of the ones we see commonly here in Vancouver, I mentioned, what happens if you've gone down to a US incubator and of course, hey, we've got some investors down here and we absolutely, even the incubator oftentimes wants to say, well, set up your LLC, set up your US organization so that we can take our piece of that. And then you've got founders up in Canada And then at some point, the company becomes big and successful enough, and they move out and they go down to the United States. Well, even just the moving out of Canada can become a taxable event, and that you can get hit with a tax bill. And remember, you've issued yourself some of these shares or some of these options at some nominal value, right? With options, a little bit more when you're exercising the options, but you've issued at some nominal value. I'm paying a penny a share, a fraction of a penny of a share. Suddenly, you've done a small fundraising round where it's $1 a share. Well, that's a what percent increase that you've got, and then suddenly you've got to pay a tax bill on that, even though you really never got that percent increase in your bank account. So you've got to be really, really careful with some of those things. Yeah.
That's a great point. In general, founders are usually just swimming as fast as they can and trying to solve every problem. You kind of wear every hat until you can eventually add a CFO or a contract CFO, add a lawyer, add a financial planner. Think about these things early though, because the way you structure your cap table is going to impact the tax consequences down the road. When you start to think about your lifetime capital gains exemption, should you have your spouse as a shareholder? Would you want to access her lifetime capital gains exemption? That's really the value that you're building in the business and how much tax you're going to pay at the end. This is a session focused on culture at your company, but you should also be concerned about how you're structuring your own shares and how you're structuring the value in the business that you're creating as well. Any other questions? In the back?
For earlier stage startup, how do you decide how much stock to issue to a specific person? Because you're selling your vision, and basically you don't know how much that person is going to contribute to your vision in the future. So if you issue a fixed stock, and even if you can have vesting, how do you get it back if that person didn't work? You know what I'm saying? Do you have any advice on dynamic equity?
I'll share my failed story and then I'll let Jeff share his successful story. So I had a drone startup, and we had someone on the cap table quite early on that seemed like she was really keen and passionate, but turns out that they weren't. And the challenge is because we didn't speak to a lawyer and we didn't actually look at the documents very thoroughly, they were just standard given to us by a small firm, we ended up actually getting kind of screwed. And that founder ultimately led to the business. One of the reasons why that business didn't end up succeeding is we had her on the cap table and we would have had to reincorporate, rebrand. It would have been a massive pain in the butt because we didn't do our due diligence on that front. So it's a great point you bring up. Now, Jeff, I don't know if you have any successful pieces to add.
I don't know what's successful. So one thing we did very early on, and this is something you always got a budget for, is we got a lawyer to set up a shareholders agreement. Shareholders agreement has triggering events that say, hey, listen, if any of the founders just quit their job, then there's trigger events that say this is what happens in that case. And so good advice is paperwork makes good friends. And it's something that you can go to as a guide. What happens if? Well, here's the steps that we take, and here's how the company might be protected in some things. In terms of just protecting yourself from a structure perspective, having that shareholders agreement early on is really, really important. When you're we started the company in a house. Right? It was just literally in the rec room of a house, full on desks, and going through the whole process. And everyone's just having fun and all that. But then all of a sudden, the money gets a little bigger. You start having some more clients. All of a sudden, you raise a bit of money. And now all of a sudden, things become more real, but you didn't set that up in the first place. So even though it can seem like it's a bit tedious, and it really is, and I hate the details, I hate the paperwork stuff, you have to go through it and early on. So not just a share purchase agreement like an ESOP, but having a shareholders agreement between you and your co-founders, super critical. The next one is have vesting schedules. A lot of companies now, they'll have vesting schedules for everyone. All the co-founders, you have your shares, but it's reverse vesting. If you leave after a year, well, then you get clawed back on a lot of those shares. If you leave after 2 years, you get clawed back on a lot of those shares. In terms of how to allocate the actual number of shares, one advice that someone gave me, and we don't really do this, was as little as they'll take. And you think about it, it's kind of a weird thing to say, but you're trying to motivate somebody, but you're also trying to protect other shareholders. And that was the advice they gave. But honestly, when you really look at it, some of the shares that we gave on day one were how much do we offer someone? Those shares are worth disproportionately to how much we'll offer to a new employee. But it's also because on day one, you need that person so much more, and you don't have capital to be able to reward them with. So you have to kind of accept the fact that, they're going to come in and they're going to get shares that might be worth a lot more, but they're taking a bigger risk. They're coming in earlier. But everything you want to do, put it on vesting. right? You want to be able to make sure the shareholders agreement triggers people if they quit. And number two, everything on vesting, whether it's even if it's monthly vesting month over month. So at least if they quit, they don't continue to get something rather than rewarding that up front. Or it's vesting on a cliff where it's, hey, listen, we're all in this together for 3 years, right? Everyone nods their head. Yeah, we're in this together. And then you put everyone on a 3-year horizon because you know that that's a certain landmark in your business, product market fit, whatever it might be. And then that's when that big cliff kind of happens. And then, yeah, if they're still there, great. And if not, well, then you avoid some of those challenges. But in terms of the actual number, I would look early on at percentages. That's really the only way to do it. But by putting people on vesting, it allows to protect you from, oh man, I gave someone 50% of this company. And I know people that have done that. 2 co-founders, one leaves 2 months into it, and they own half that company. And now you have to start all over again by reincorporating or going through the legal process.
So I guess a good question would be, when you have issued options, setting cliffs for founders though, how do you ensure that they are meeting requirements? Because it's one thing to be actively involved in the business, and then there's another thing to be minimally actively involved in the business. So Jeff, I don't think you've had this problem in the past, so maybe Andrew, if you've seen any on your side where there's been minimally active founders who have shares on the cap table, is there any way to deal with that, or no?
I'm just going to take a step for a second. We're using a lot of technical terms here, and I know that last time we had a bit of this conversation, we actually went and broke down what a stock option is and how it works. Does anybody need us to do that breakdown? Does everybody understand when we're talking terms like vesting and shareholders agreements? Everybody's good? There's no shame in saying, okay, cool. Okay, so from a legal perspective, you have me sitting here as a lawyer, there's not much you can do. There's not much that is usually done that ties, when you're thinking about employees or advisors in a company, that ties their performance to their options. There are, as Jeff mentioned, there's going to be potentially an ESOP, an employee stock option plan, that governs. There's going to be individual agreements, sort of a contract between the company and the recipient of the option, and it's going to have vesting terms and other provisions. And usually one of those provisions is, if you quit or if you get fired, well, if you quit, we'll give you an extra 3 months or 6 months or whatever it is to be able to exercise your options, and then you're cut off. If you get fired, we might cut you off that day as we're showing you out the door, as it were, right? There's potentially different circumstances that lead to it. Very rarely will you actually see, if you don't hit these performance goals, then we're going to claw back some options, we're going to take away your options, your vesting schedule is going to be longer, those sorts of things. Pretty much the only time you ever see anything that complicated is with respect to executive compensation. And you do see that sometimes. If you close the next financing round, we're going to give you this cut of it as long as you're still with it. Or if you get fired after a result of selling your company, you actually get an extra bonus because we know that you went to all the trouble of getting this sold, and if they decide they don't like you, well, we don't want you to be disincentivized from going out and getting this company ready for sale. So if for some reason they terminate you, you're going to get an extra payment. A lot of the very complex pieces around that are worked in really for executives. The mantra that you want, especially like we're sitting here in VentureLabs at the startup phase of your company, keep it simple. You don't want investors coming in, you don't want somebody potentially looking at buying your company, and they come in and they look at the cap table and they go, what is this? Like, why do you have 7 different classes of shares? Why do you have options issued to 500 people, some of whom might have exercised those options, and suddenly you've got maybe 200 people on your cap table, 200 shareholders. There's some very good stories in this town of very well-known companies where they were getting big, record-breaking, headline-getting investments, and behind the scenes, what was happening is some of the lawyers were going to all the trouble of buying out all those little shareholders and getting them to accept the deal, because otherwise they could potentially be a giant pain in the ass moving forward to take care of that. So it's one of the things you got to be really careful with, not just in who's getting on it and the size of it, but keep your terms standard. You don't want to pay a bunch of lawyers later on down the road to look at your documents. Your lawyers should, if they're experienced in this space, they should be able to tell you, the quote is, what's market? What is standard in this organization? If you expect to have a strong American presence, a strong Silicon Valley presence, what's going to be market down there in Silicon Valley? Well, you have 10 million shares authorized, you have 5 million shares issued at the start, the next 5 million shares are going to be issued to people through options and other incentives, right? So they should be able to give you a little bit of guidance. As an overall perspective though, you've got an hour here with us and a lot of back and forth. Get good advisors, get good mentors, because there's always going to be, like many other things in developing your business, there's always going to be some other question that comes up that you need that guidance on. Find some people, hey, I've learned that I should be asking you guys for some options if I'm going to be one of your advisors. But find some people that can help guide you through that at the various stages of growth of your business. That's going to be a very important piece because there's a lot of complexity and a lot of nuance to it.
Yeah, that's a great point, Andrew. And certain advisors, they do charge by the hour, so you just need to, of course, be respectful of that time. Other advisors, they may not, but they may want you to thank them in other ways. So it is important to build out your advisory team early on, who aligns with your business, who has some domain knowledge that's going to actually help you get to that next level. Any other questions in the room?
So the question was, if one of your co-founders or an equity holder passes away, or maybe leaves the business, what is there in place, or what's available to you as recourse? Or does the spouse end up taking that over, or the estate, and now you have someone on your cap table who isn't involved in your business at all? So I can't really speak to it. I'll let Brandon talk to the sort of insurance product side. From my perspective, in our shareholders agreement, we have triggering clauses. So even if we fired a co-founder or we fired someone who was at the beginning that kind of really, really important person, basically the company has an opportunity, or the other shareholders, to recoup those shares and bring those back in. I mean, if you look at the reasons why companies or startups fail, obviously funding is one of them, but inter-founder strife is often one of the biggest challenges. And it's where, okay, we're all gonna quit our jobs and start this company, and then one person doesn't, but you already assigned that equity to them, or they're going to do it on the side, or one of those types of things where you're kind of moonlighting. That's where you get into trouble. So our shareholders agreement governs what happens if you quit, what happens if you fired, or what happens if any other unforeseen circumstances. The other big one is divorce. And I know it sounds weird, like I'm a single guy, but I've seen that in companies where divorce is so common now, where it's great. Now they're having a huge, marital dispute, and they're going through the divorce proceedings, and your company can't raise money because of a holdout that's happening, or there's other factors that come with that, because that person now has rights to half of that equity. So the triggering clause in our shareholders agreement accounts for that. In terms of if the hit by a bus and that person actually passed away, I'll let Brandon kind of refer to that.
Thanks, Jeff. I actually have a slide on this, which I don't get into unless someone asks the question, but generally, how we like to see founders set up their shareholders agreement is having life insurance contracts owned by the corporation that would cover the cost of those shares in the event one of the founders was to pass away. So essentially how that would work is, let's say John and Jim, they own the company. Now, if John was to pass away, generally his shares would go to the estate, which would mean that his family now owns those shares. It could be the spouse, kids, etc. In the shareholders agreement, you can actually articulate to have this insurance policy, which would pay to the corporation, and that money would then flow through to the family to cover the cost of those shares. And if that's articulated before the death actually occurring, there's going to be no negotiation with the family about what that amount is, because it was articulated in the shareholders agreement. So this is generally how we set this up for founders, and it's important to do that earlier rather than later. Yeah.
How do you evaluate the shares? Sometimes
That's a great point. So there's a number of valuation techniques. John in the back actually is an expert at that. So it depends on the industry, it depends on how much revenue is being generated, the growth. I'm not a valuation expert, but generally we bring on someone who will do that.
You're talking about privately held company, right?
Pardon me, sir?
You're not public. You're not talking about
private. Yeah.
And to that point around the valuation, it's not exactly how you value, but our shareholders agreement actually has, this is the process you go through if this happens. So it's not about knowing what that valuation will be on the outset. This is the process we're going to use in the event that this happens. So our shareholders agreement has a whole bunch of just instructions. All right, if founder leaves, here's the 5 steps that you go through. Part of that is hire an accountant to value things. If someone dies, this is the process you go through. So our shareholders agreement dictates that in terms of how we go about that process.
Great. Any other questions, sir?
A couple of them actually.
Yeah.
Just about what you just were saying. How did you come up with that shareholder agreement? Did you work through your lawyers, or did you have a template you worked with, or some suggestions from a previous company?
So early on, like talking about advisors, we had a lawyer do it. So we had a guy named Andrew Robertson at Lawson Lundell. He was fantastic, and he basically had a startup package that was basic employment agreements, stock options agreements, the shareholders agreement, and like advisory contracts. So he basically gave us like these 10 template documents, and then we worked off of those with him to be able to establish that. But that advice up front was very critical to us in terms of establishing that. I'm not good at any of these things, right? But that's why I have Brandon do my benefits. I have 3 lawyers, 2 accountants, and it's not that you're paying them to stay on retainer, it's do you have someone you can call? So before you start that company or early on, you should have your roster of here's the 10 people that we call if anything happens. Because the worst thing is something happens and you're like, oh, now I have to find someone, I have to trust them, I have to teach them about our business, and then they have to actually give me advice and counsel. You want to get that out of the way early on, so you just have your kind of your roster of people. Yep, here's the 10 people in each of these spaces, whether it's banking, finance, insurance, legal side that you can call to be able to access this stuff. But we got it out of the way right away at the very beginning, and that was advice we had from advisors, and it made a ton of sense. And it's been super helpful having that in place.
And sort of picking up on that, so all of those things cost some money. So, you know, in the couple of startups I've been involved with, we worked with Basque and I remember who our current guys are. But anyway, and they're all pretty pricey. So, you know, setting this stuff up costs a lot of money. Is there a low cost version that you did? Could you share roughly what it cost you to set up that package at the start?
I don't remember what the exact number was, but it was pretty palatable because it was very scoped. Where you end up running up a whole bunch of fees is you go to someone that's like, sure, I'm gonna bill you by the hour, and then they're starting to come up with this stuff from scratch.
I hate to pin you down.
Yeah.
Less than 20,000?
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Less than 10,000?
Yeah.
Less than 5,000?
It was somewhere in that range. I don't remember the exact number. But basically, you know what? You might think, oh, we should spend it on a product or whatever, but I think it's important to have these things out of the way. But it was, hey, here's like the certain agreement templates you need, and then you can work off of those and you can kind of figure out through things yourself, but it's not going back to them for every little thing after that because you have the templates out front.
Everything that Jeff and Brandon are telling you, very good feedback. I've actually just met Jeff today. This is actually really, really insightful. I'm gonna pick on something in your previous question before I answer. Should I get a template? Like from the internet, like I should Google this and download something? Don't ever do that. Don't ever turn that into a legal document. Don't ever do that. Just don't. It's gonna cost you a lot more money to fix a problem, and it's gonna be a problem. Don't do it. Find some lawyers, talk to them for cheap. Realistically, dealing with startups, again, I come out of Waterloo, I've been around startups since long before I was a lawyer. The reality of your lives as people that are running startups is it's gonna be what they call a pay now or pay later business. And you're going to make the decision. You're going to ask a lot of the questions. Sorry, Nick, correct?
Yeah.
And you're actually from Waterloo too, aren't you?
Yeah.
Okay, that's where I recognize you from. You're going to have to make that decision. I'm hiring my first employee. Do I get a lawyer to draft my employment contracts? I'm doing my stock option plan. Do I get a lawyer to draft this? Right? What's it going to cost? What's it not? A lot of times, and realistically, you might make that decision that you're going to do it off the back of a napkin. You're going to download a template off the internet. Again, don't do it, but you might, right? Just recognize that when push comes to shove down the road, especially if your company becomes more successful and there's money on the table, and people want some of that money off the table, you might have to pay more to fix it than you would have initially. So it's a little bit tough. So answering some of these questions, in the last 5 years, since there's been a lot of money put into startups by investors and there's a lot of success stories, law firms have been tripping over each other to offer the startup packages of the kind that Jeff has mentioned. $5,000 is a reasonable range. Some of them say, this is our package, there it is, take it or leave it. Some of them say, well, it's a little bit of a menu, and if you pick some of these pieces of the menu, it could actually be a little bit less, but somewhere in the neighborhood of $5,000, maybe a little bit less, is reasonable. As Jeff mentioned, you might even just get your ESOP, your employee stock option plan, in as part of that. Again, this is part of my earlier advice about keep it simple. You don't want to do anything too complex. Any lawyer worth their salt is going to have a private company stock option plan sitting in the back pocket that you can use as a really good starting place, and it shouldn't cost you a whole lot of money, right? It could be a couple grand. If you come in and say, well, I've got this cool advice of something I watched on the TV show Silicon Valley, and I think this is a really important complex mechanism to put in, and that does happen, that's going to become a more expensive stock option plan for you. So realistically, to nail it down to price, if you come in out of the door, want something really simple, don't mess with it too much, a couple grand is not going to be too bad. But if you come in with something really complex, or you want something that's very different, for bespoke, it's going to cost you a lot more, and you can go right up to, you know, whether you have a public company stock option plan and some of the requirements in there. Keep it simple. It's going to cost you less. It's going to be easier for everyone to understand. But if you can get it rolled up in a startup package somebody has, even better.
At the end of the day, I think it comes back to what Jeff shared about getting the right people on the bus. The professionals that you have working with your business are pretty similar to the employees you're bringing onto your business. They're investing time into you. And a lot of them might not make much early on in those relationships, but if you crush it, that's where they want to make some more cash. And you're likely going to work with the professionals that helped you when you were just getting started when you're crushing it. So some professionals that come out and talk to at events like this is not because we're going to make a lot of money early on with a lot of companies. It's because we actually love working with tech companies and we want to see them be successful. And if a few of them do really well, maybe we'll make some money as well. That's how we like to look at it.
Can I comment on that? Just
Please,
one?
yeah.
One thing around that's a lot just about price and about how much does this cost. One thing when you go into any of these meetings, say, hey, we're a startup. How do you feel about the fact that we're not going to pay on time? And if they're like, no, we're this huge law firm and we're going to charge you all this money and we want, well, it's like, they're not the right law firm for you, right? There are lawyers who are like, yeah, they want to try and almost act like a VC, pick the small companies they work with, understanding that, yeah, they're not going to quite bill you for everything. They're going to be good to you. It's going to be a balance, but eventually you're going to go through a big financing round to get a bunch of work out of it. Right? So you also want to pick firms that like are used to working with startups that are good at building a relationship with you, not just someone who's like, yeah, it's gonna be 20 grand or go away. They're not the right law firm for you, period. So if you're not able to go in and have a candid conversation about how much you have, what you're trying to achieve, and if they're not being like, yeah, we know how to work with startups, we get it, we have this package in place for this exact reason, if they're not sort of saying things like that are like, we've been there before, then that's a bad sign. They're not the right partner for you at the stage of business. Later on, if you want to go get a multinational huge law firm because you're this huge startup and you're going public, go do that later. But the ones that you're going to work with earlier on are going to be either a boutique shop or they're going to be someone who really gets it and is really good with acting with it. You know, and that's where you're going to say with a lot of this money aspect to it, it's about the answers they're saying. Well, you know what? Don't be afraid to get up and be like, this isn't the right company for me. Or I'm going to go talk to a few people. And the ones that are the best, I've had a lot of people that are like, yeah, well, if you come to the office, I'm going to bill you for it. But lunch meetings, that's free advice. Coffee meetings, right? They're just like, oh, you know, and they'll give you a tidbit here, tidbit there. You can ask some questions. So that's the relationship you want to build with these early advisors, regardless of whether it's legal or otherwise, where they get that you're a startup. They get that you're an early company, and the expectations shouldn't be that they're bleeding you dry from a cash perspective.
Going back to the stock options, for Andrew, excuse me, Andrew, you are talking, or there was mention of having provisions or terms so that you don't get diluted. I mean, if you want a simple stock option, then you issue common shares. So what sort of terms do you use that prevent dilution?
Okay, so to be clear, in a stock option plan, it would be very unusual to have anti-dilution provisions. Stock option plan is usually governing, again, who gets the options, how much you pay for them, how much you pay at exercise, you know, what happens if you quit, what happens if you get fired, what happens if you die, those sorts of questions. When you're talking about anti-dilution protection, you're usually actually talking about a shareholders agreement, the piece that Jeff raised. In the US context, and you can go online right now, you can look at what the National Venture Capital Association in the US has. You can download their model documents. They don't call it a shareholder agreement. They'll call one a right of first refusal and co-sale agreement. But you have, because what it is it's an agreement between people that have, whether it's shares or in some cases, oftentimes you don't actually have option holders sign up for these things, but it's a requirement to exercise the option that once you are a shareholder, you sign these documents. Otherwise, well, let's say you got 3 founders and 100 option holders and they all exercise their options, then you have 100 shareholders that aren't part of your shareholders agreement. That doesn't make any sense. The types of protections usually are things like, if the company is going to issue new options from Treasury as they call it, or sorry, not options, but new shares from Treasury, then you get a right of first refusal to be able to purchase pro rata. So if you held 2% before, then you can buy enough. You have the right to buy on the same terms as whoever else is going to buy the same amount that would keep you at 2%. Now again, 2 things to emphasize. One, that's not necessarily on the option side. That's really usually once you've exercised in its shares. The other one is you might pay for it, right? If you're an early employee and you paid 20 cents a share and then your company's done really well and they're going out and they're doing a raise for $2 a share, well, it does occur in some agreements where you say you can get it for 20 cents a share or you can get it for no money. Usually you're not going to get that deal as an employee, and usually you're not going to give that deal to your employees. Usually it's going to be, if we're raising $2 a share, your right is to go in and buy it for $2 a share, right? That might be more money than you have or than your employees have. In some cases, if they really want to maintain that percentage, that means they go out and they find that money to be able to buy into it. That's the traditional protection in terms of anti-dilution. Question, sure. Yeah.
Hey, yeah, I have a question about the stock options. I was told that and this is something I've come up with a conversation with a lot of other startups, that we were always told, or I was always told, that the strike price has to be not yet in the money at the time that we're giving the stock options and issuing the stock options for tax purposes to be able to avoid the tax implications for the employees. But I was recently told that that's not the case for private startups, and for that reason we don't have to have like a 60-cent strike price. We could have a nominal strike price. What's the latest and greatest on this subject? Is the jury still out about what's allowed, or is it very clear cut and I've just been told different things?
It's very clear cut. You know the answer I'm going to give is it depends. And I'm sorry that I was making about it. So you actually raised part of the it depends yourself. So are you talking public or are you talking private? Public being publicly listed on a stock market. There's going to be different sets of rules for public companies in terms of exchange. Generally speaking, what you're typically talking about in a private company situation is any tax implications for the exercise and for the issuance of those shares. And that will depend. A lot of the things you're going to have to look into are, again, who are the people that are holding those when they're exercising? Where are they residents of? Where is your company resident of? How have certain other pieces changed? It's a little bit complex for a sort of a lunchtime discussion here. Generally speaking, you want to have the exercise price at, when you issue it, what you think the value of the shares is. That is traditional, okay? That may fluctuate, and then again, you're an emerging company, you're a startup. You're not going to pay somebody to go and do a business valuation every time that you want to be able to issue options to figure out what the exercise price should be. So a lot of cases in a smaller company, you're going to have sort of a set, this is what we think the company was worth, or at least this is our framework for valuing it to be able to determine what those exercise prices are. You might even in the very earliest stages just say, okay, we're going to have a nominal exercise price, there you go. Not the end of the world for a private company, but you're never going to get rid of the situation where some shareholder has some interesting tax implication. Anybody else here in the room a Canadian and American citizen? Nobody else? Just me? Poor me. And Brandon knows better. We have some and there's hundreds of thousands of us, I think there's millions of us in Canada, hundreds of thousands at least, and we have some very special tax situations that we've got to be very careful of what we accept. So even if you go to the trouble of saying what's sort of the common wisdom or how do you normally do things, that's not always going to have you avoid somebody coming to the table as one of your employees someday saying, this really did not work out for my situation, right? One of the situations, and this is a public company, this is not such a private one, I've got a friend that went and took a job at a public company. Congratulations, you get a bunch of options, go process the paperwork. And they had to follow this rule that the exercise price can't be lower than whatever the market price of that share is. Well, she happened to get hired on in a good position, so a lot of options, at a time where this company was going up in value really quickly. And from the time where she said, yes, I'll accept this job, here's the paperwork, to the time a week later when somebody said, okay, we're going to process this paperwork, the share price went up, and so her option exercise price went through the roof. And she had to have a big fight with them to say, you should accept it at the time when I said, here's the paperwork. So there's a lot of little technicalities that you got to really be careful of.
I can comment on that. I can just tell you what we did. Like, we're a private company, super startup, super simple. Like, if you're in a public company shell and you're doing something, like, you're smart enough that this isn't really you're not necessarily at a lunch and learn, so to speak, but like, for us, day one, it was nominal strike price. And we're basically saying, hey, if you get on the bus right now, anything that we all do together, great, you get the uptake in that. And then we raised money on a couple of different sequences, and as you raise money, you're like, what's the company worth? The last thing we raised money at. Only place you got to be really, really careful when you issue stock options, whether it's employees, advisors, or otherwise, is it adds the number of shares that are outstanding. So if you have 100 shares, $1 a share, you issue a whole bunch of options, and now you have 200 shares, you just doubled the valuation of your company. The challenge with that is when you go to raise more money, if you can't raise that money at $1 a share because now it has to have a double valuation. Does that make sense? So you got to be careful how many shares you just put out there into the ecosystem, because at the same share price, you're going to end up with a higher overall valuation, and you might not be able to honor that continual uptake if you have issued like 1 million extra shares out to employees. So when it comes to nominal versus strike price, you can avoid some of those challenges, but we just went nominal from day one, and then we increased that strike price based on the couple of financing rounds we did. It wasn't like a week-to-week basis like you would in a public company. It was like, we're 2 years old, we've raised 2 rounds. And that's kind of the staggered structure that we've had. That's your valuation at the last time, is what someone paid for it the last time they paid for it.
Thanks so much for coming, and hopefully you enjoyed the session today. And thanks so much to Jeff and to Andrew.